Okay, so Buendeo Padichi Biguri. My name is Dr. Jessica Hernandez, and I'm from the Maya Chorti and Binisa Nations. Thank you for being today here at the panel entitled Indigenous Perspectives on Environmental Justice. So, before we begin, I would like to give a quick session description. So, today we're going to be discussing about cultural erasure, political disenfranchisement, economic divestment, and an ever growing climate crisis that has accumulated in many indigenous communities facing dire environmental injustices and health disparities. In this session, panelists belonging to a diverse indigenous and tribal backgrounds in advocacy and academia will discuss their views on the present environmental, energy, and climate justice movements. So I would like to give each panelist 10 seconds to introduce themselves. So let's start with Joseph.
Haumataki Chante Washtena Pichizapulo. My name is Joseph Gazing Wolf. I'm from the Lakota people at Standing Rock. My mother is also Amazigh and Nubian from North Africa. I am a senior global future scientist at Arizona State University and currently completing my PhD there as well.
And you can pass it to somebody else. Thank you.
I can just go if it makes it easier, because once you're on screen, you can't see the other names, right? So it's,
yeah. Jacqueline maybe, or somebody else.
Okay. Hello. My name is, I'm echoing. My name is Jacqueline Shirley. I'm calling in from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm a tribal member of the native village of Hooper Bay in Southwest Alaska. Welcome everybody to our session. Thank you. And whoever's next, I can't see anybody.
Okay, Deborah. Thank you.
I'll go next. I know. I think that was the issue there before. So good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. I am calling in or SteamYarding in, I guess you could say, from Toronto, Ontario. And so, Oni bonjour, my name is Deborah McGregor. I am from Whitefish River First Nation. I'm in Anishinaabe. Right now, I am in Toronto, so quite a ways from home, and looking forward to this discussion this afternoon. And thank you for joining us.
Hi, I can go next. Yate, everyone. It's Chelsea Chi. I'm the Deputy Director for Native Renewables. It's nice to be here. I'm excited to have this conversation.
And last but not least, Amber.
Pesche, everyone. Estongo, Amber Chehochepkados, Ishtimaskogogi Does, Lestogi Does, Lojagogi, Amalegida Dos, Lojapoga, Amatowa Dos. Hi, everybody. I'm Amber. I'm Muskogee and African American. My tribal town is Lojapoga, and my clan is the Turtle Clan. I'm currently in Portland, Oregon, or Kalapuya land, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with my fellow panelists. And yeah, thanks for having me, Maro.
Okay, thank you all for introducing yourself. So, Buendeo Padiuchi, as mentioned, I'm Dr. Jessica Hernandez, and I will be today's moderators. I'll be moderating from Cado and Capao lands, also known as Little Rock, Arkansas. So, our first question for the entire panel is cultural erasure, political disenfranchisement, economic divestment, and an ever-growing climate crisis has accumulated in indigenous communities facing dire environmental and climate injustices, as well as health disparities. What are some of the current environmental burdens that indigenous communities face today? And we can start with Amber, and then you can call on the next person, Amber.
Okay, so I think that one of the biggest obstacles or problems that Indigenous peoples face is like the constant erasure and dispossession of both of our like culture and our lands and access to the right to tribal and cultural sovereignty, right? I think that a lot of our problems have to do with, settler colonialism, white supremacy, and racial capitalism. I think so many of us are striving to undo the legacy of all of those issues that we currently face on a daily basis. And so I think having the right to our sovereignty, having actualized sovereignty, to be able to make decisions for ourselves, to make decisions for the places that we call home, the places that we should have the right to stewardship. There is no such thing as environmental justice without land back, without recognizing and validating the stewardship and the sovereignty that Indigenous people globally have, right? So I think a lot of our outcomes, our health outcomes, our disparities have a lot to do with the types of genocides we face, right? The type of dispossessions that we face. And so I think that, again, climate injustice, environmental injustice, all of that has to do with the ways in which we have been forcibly removed, forcibly displaced, and then our sovereignty not recognized. So I'm not a statistician. I'm not a researcher, but what I do know is people on the ground have tangible, real life, acute disparities because of this ongoing legacy of settler colonialism, white supremacy, racial capitalism. And that's my overall take. Whoever would like to go next, because I can't see the next person, have at it. How about Joseph?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Starks. Amber, thank you so much. For me, what's fresh on my mind now is where I was working this summer, which is this picture behind me here, along the Napo River in Ecuador, where I was working with the Quechua people, and then further up the river, the Waorani people. And while we were there, we organized a protest and a resistance, because what's going on here is essentially what's been going on all over Indian country, that is planet Earth, everywhere, with every indigenous nation that I've worked with, in North Africa, Southeast Asia, here in Latin America. Basically, the local politicians are paid off by oil and mining companies, and then these oil and mining companies come in and illegally tear down the forest and engage in their extractive methodologies, and then they throw any toxins into the rivers. Any garbage that they have, they throw into the rivers. And so basically, as you're traveling down this river that these indigenous communities use for everything, right? For food, for water, to sustain the forest itself, which sustains them. You find just giant packs of trash. The waters become murky with all the chemical toxins that these companies dump into it. And we're talking companies like Chevron and Shell, et cetera. And then these companies come in and basically say, well, you poor indigenous people, like, you can't sustain your own lands anymore, right? You have no sustainable livelihoods. You can't feed your own families. So what we're going to do is we're going to create sustainable livelihoods for you. You're going to come work for us. And in fact, there's a whole city called Shell. Welcome to Shell, Ecuador. We're going to build a whole city where we'll build houses for you guys there. Just leave the forest, come live here. We'll give you good pay, and then you'll work for us now. Right? So many of these communities have become divided in terms of families and communities that stay in the forest and try to continue to protect protect the forest, and others that have kind of been squeezed out of that lifestyle by many different means, some of which I just mentioned, into going and working for these same companies. And so it's literally brother against brother, cousin against cousin, um, fighting either to protect the forest or to work for these extractive and illegal mining operations that are taking place. So that's just one example of many that's going on along the Amazon basin, and like I said, all over the world where I've worked, similar things are happening.
Thank you for that, Joseph. Deborah?
So just to build upon what others have already mentioned, and in response to the question, I thought one of the fundamental challenges is, as pointed out, is decision making. I find Indigenous folks at whatever level are often on the outside looking in, and then in a position of advocacy, activism, protection, for example, water protectors. You don't get to be the decision maker, so you're trying to influence decision making even within your own on your own territories, or you're trying to influence policy. You're always trying to influence, even internationally in those forums. So I think this lack of decision making is hugely problematic because it's already situating Indigenous people in a particular silo. Right? You're not decision makers, or we need to help Indigenous people. So there's already kind of a box for Indigenous peoples, First Nations, or tribal peoples, Indigenous peoples around the world, as opposed to actually you should be a decision maker. You should be directing, influencing global policy, public policy, as opposed to actually being able to lead in the way that folks are like. I mean, it could happen internally, but maybe that relates to the second question. But that's kind of what I see, as others have pointed out, where the origin of the injustice is often external to the community, but you're not in a decision making kind of position. The other aspect that I see to this in the Canadian context more specifically, because I can't speak to what's happening with tribes per se. What I see is, because we're not seen as decision makers, even though communities are making decisions all the time at the community level, but in these broader frameworks, not making decisions on the outside looking in, have to go to litigation, whatever, trying to influence this decision making, is there isn't really support to support Indigenous decision making, despite the rhetoric, despite, oh, there's Indigenous governance, sovereignty, self-determination. But communities in the Canadian context, I'm comfortable more saying, need the capacity and the support to be able to do that. And often they're not. The support comes from, let's say, my participation in this initiative, my participation in this policy making venture. It's not, hey, maybe we want to make these decisions ourselves and need support ourselves in my own community or nation to be able to make these decisions. So there's a real, fundamentally, I guess, a lack of respect for what First Nations decision making and governance and autonomy and sovereignty looks like. People they don't want you there. They just want you to input into other processes. So that's why, just building upon what others have said, that I've noticed as a huge challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Right, like the lack of respect that is often given to Indigenous communities kind of prevents us from having some power in that decision making in these colonial entities. Chelsea, to repeat the question again, what are some of the current environmental burdens that Indigenous communities face today?
Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to provide a little bit of context before answering this question, because Indigenous communities, there's so many of us, and a lot of us have different cultures and different languages, different experiences. Yeah, there are some that are overlapping and some that are similar, but I just wanted to create that context, and I'm only able to speak on what I've experienced as a Navajo young person, and then working both in the community, at the grassroots level, and then also in the political realm for a while, and now as a nonprofit, working to increase access for energy independence for the homes that we install solar for. For the environmental burdens that I've seen, both for the Dene Navajo Nations and for Hopi, is restoration and rebalance. There are histories of organizations, companies, entities coming in and wanting things from Native people and not sharing the whole story. Lots of other things there. But once they leave, there's all of these gaps that are left. There's water that was used to help with the industry to make it what it is today, in energy industries, and that can't be replaced. Water that could be used for drinking water, to grow food, to create, to keep sustainable communities alive. And then also with families, Joseph kind of mentioned that sometimes when industry comes in and they leave some they leave some hard, harmful relationships between families and communities. And so when they're gone, it's up to the communities to restore and rebalance that. And it's taking a really long time, and it's going to take a really long time. Those are just like little pieces of the environmental burdens that I've seen. Additionally, not only the land that's not the land that was used for energy production or extraction can't be, it's never going to be what it was before. So how do you restore that land to be something that we can use now? Another piece, I know it says environmental burdens now is because of global warming, and the weather that we're seeing now in the Southwest is pretty extreme. So there are, in the summers, our monsoon seasons have been pretty intense. Yes, the moisture is a blessing, but when it comes down in huge amounts and we're not ready for those things, our thoroughfares, our roads to get from our homes to a paved road is now demolished, and getting from home to a grocery store, or home to a clinic, or home to school is just a little harder. Same thing for the wintertime. We had some, again, pretty amazing moisture, but I'm going to say in the most recent future, we haven't seen those things. And so it's challenging for us to do things like I said, get groceries, get medicine. And additionally, those are just like a little piece of some of the burdens that like my community faces. And to be one, I think the one that hits me the hardest is for Navajo and Hopi. They've had a coal mine for almost 40 years in their lands, but the coal was used to electrify southern Arizona and part of Nevada. Phoenix, Tucson, and Las Vegas got energy because of our community members, and those community members, and a lot of them don't have electricity. So that for me was it's a huge question. Like, how is that possible for the people who are contributing to electricity for other people not having that, not having access to it? And so for me, working with Native Renewables, I wanted to be a part of that solution and try to address those burdens. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chelsea. I think it's important, right, to mention how climate change is kind of exacerbating these environmental burdens that our communities are already experiencing. And also mentioning that as Indigenous peoples, right, even though oftentimes policies and discourses treat us as one group, we're very distinct in our own identities. So to reemphasize the question, and we can move to Jacqueline, what are some of the current environmental burdens that Indigenous communities face today?
Thank you. Well, on the question, I kind of, of course, I echo everything and support all my panelists and what they said, Koyana. I just want to kind of go back to the precursor of the descriptor before the question: cultural erasure, political disenfranchisement, economic disinvestment, ever-growing climate crisis have accumulated in many Indigenous communities facing dire environmental and climate injustices and health disparities. That's the answer to the question, all that. So whoever gave the precursor did their research well, because that's the answer to the question, all that. Of course, I was, Amber, she hit on exactly when I first read the question, that word current, because this is not an acute current thing that tribal nations and Indigenous people have been facing. It has been centuries. And we have always had environmental burdens since we were existed. But we've always been able to move, be nomadic, and work with our environment as environment presents itself to us, not the other way around. So as we have become civilized and forced to be non-nomadic, especially in rural Alaska and in Alaska, it is created a lot of havoc, both with our animals and with our humans and with our waters and with our plants. You know, even the term permafrost, pretty soon, somebody's going to have to change the name of that because it's not permanent anymore. The permafrost is melting. And so scientists now and society now, you guys are worried about, the methane. Oh, well, that is nothing compared to what is going to be released once that loop starts really moving forward, when all that permafrost starts melting. So for Alaska and many coastal cities and towns and villages in our coastal coastline in this country, it's about relocation. What's happening to these communities that are having to be forcibly relocated because of erosion? And so that is one critical issue in Alaska I can speak on. And I work with within the 13 Western states. And so many tribes within the 13 states, including Hawaii, our Indigenous brothers and sisters there, have been suffering from all the precursors before the question. And so, thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. And I think that's important what you mentioned, right? That our Kanaka Maoli brothers and sisters are suffering necessarily these dire environmental burdens. We're seeing how in Hawaii, right, Maui experienced that wildfire, and while knowing that climate change doesn't necessarily directly result in wildfires, it results in the conditions that create these massive wildfires. So to move on to our next question, and oftentimes, right, as Indigenous peoples, we're asked for the solutions to these problems that we are not necessarily responsible for. Are there any suggestions on what we can do to lessen the burden while also enhancing climate and energy justice within these communities, and particularly our communities, right? The communities that we work with, given that as Indigenous peoples, we're not a monolithic group. And I will start with Deborah this time.
Okay, thank you. It's a great question. I think what I would, I'll just speak to sort of my thinking at the moment, because I think there is a lot of there's a lot of generation of solutions that people have come up with. But what I'm particularly interested in the research that I'm engaging with now, and particularly Indigenous climate justice, is Indigenous communities or nations, however they're organizing themselves governance wise, to come up with their own solutions. And again, this may be specific to the Canadian context, where a lot of the times we're in a position of reacting to other people's solutions and not really having the opportunity to generate our own, if we want to call them solutions or pathways to sustainability. People have different sort of visions for what they see as popping out of this scenario that others have talked about. And in the previous question, like outlining all those inequities and dysfunction and basically kind of genocidal tendencies by the state in relation to Indigenous peoples. So to me, I'd like to see Indigenous people starting to create those themselves based on their own knowledge, their own science, their own way of life, their own values, and what their strengths are. Now, this is not to say all these other situations, inequities and burdens are there. People talked about them quite eloquently to the first question. It's just I find in the context that I often work in, um, other people, usually governments, and the kind of funding programs that they have, or NGOs and others, they kind of decide, this is what we understand the problem to be. This is what we have to offer up to you, Indigenous peoples. Apply for this or work with us on this, as opposed to it coming from Indigenous peoples themselves. Having said that, I actually think a lot of Indigenous people do. I think a lot of I just call them the dots, already exist within communities, the language revitalization programs, land-based programs, work with youth. To me, those are where innovation and creativity is going to be generated, to be able to kind of see past a thing that's blowing up in our face to envision some kind of future that we want to move towards. I think, I mean, in Anishinaabe in particular, we are visionary people, right? Like we're seeking this vision in terms of our lives and our future, and what's going to enable us to do that. It's usually not other people's solutions. It's usually generating them ourselves. So I don't know exactly what those programs are going to look like. I've seen them. I know people have developed climate change programs, developing their own plans and strategies. But in the Canadian context, we're a bit behind on that in terms of at the community or the First Nation level. Most of the time, we're inputting into other people's solutions. And if you challenge them, people get pretty uptight about that. They spend a lot of energy and time into trying to get you to come along to that sort of solution, because they're often not rooted in Indigenous lifeways, which did maintain sustainable relationships over time. And I'm not saying we were perfect in the Anishinaabe context. Certainly we weren't, but we learned from that. And because we were sovereign and self-determining for really most of our existence, thousands of years, we could solve it on our own. But now we've got these other factors, these other interferences in our ability to be able to do that. So I'd like to see the generation of programs coming from the community itself, as opposed to constantly putting all our energy into reacting to what other people's solutions are. So hopefully that made sense. I know I'm not dealing with the big questions, but it's just sort of where I'm at and what I'm seeing in the work that I'm doing. So Chimigwech for allowing me to share that.
Yeah, Paducci, thank you, Deborah. I think that's important what you emphasize, right? Where these solutions have to come from the Indigenous communities themselves, as opposed to these other outside entities trying to solve our issues when they don't necessarily know what our communities are undergoing. So, to move on again to the same question, what are some of the solutions that you propose for us to achieve climate and energy justice within our communities? Joseph, I will send it to you.
So just based on my experience of kind of working on the ground with different communities, both here in North America and elsewhere, um, two things that I would say have been fairly successful is bringing communities together. So one of the big things I work on is Indigenous unity, and trying to bring different tribes and communities together, because I've seen it where it's worked to empower the individual communities through knowledge sharing, through political activism, etc. We're a much more powerful voice if we're 7 tribes coming together rather than one. And I've seen this work in among the northeastern Plains tribes back home for me, with the Ocheti Chakowin, for example, and the whole Standing Rock debacle. And I've seen it work in Latin America and Africa and elsewhere where I've worked, where if we bring different communities together, we can mount greater protests and greater resistance and share resources, etc. And so that's one way that we can lessen the burden, is to come together as relatives. Of course, that creates its own set of problems, right? Which is understandable, but I think the benefits far outweigh the problems in this case. And the other thing is to think about, to kind of go back to our roots in terms of thinking about how we handle resources. So within our communities, the communities that are really struggling. So like in this part of the world behind me here, where I work with a smaller Quechua community, in the 6 weeks that I was there, something like 5 different families ended up losing their land and having to move, which decimates the family. The languages go away, et cetera, right? And then the foreigners who are coming in and buying up these lands instantly do things like turn them into pig farms. So the forest is completely cleared, and then you establish a pig farm right next to this water source that feeds into the Amazon River eventually, right? So it's just a complete and utter destruction of both indigenous culture, indigenous language, and the environment that we all rely on. So the solution in this case that I've seen, the communities that I've seen resist this type of displacement that's taking place all over the world at the moment, and especially in the Amazon, is if they hold land as a community, right? So if they form a foundation, if the tribal community forms a foundation and they hold it in a communal possession, as opposed to individual families owning specific plots, that paradigm seems to work much better in terms of protecting indigenous land and keeping it in indigenous hands. And so that's another solution, right? So again, indigenous unity across tribes, but also unity within tribes in terms of natural resources management. Those are 2 really effective methods. The other thing that, again, within our own communities that has worked is having good leadership, having strong leadership that is concerned about the tribe and not concerned about bottom lines or feeding their own pockets or feeding their own power structures or whatever. So having leadership that is answerable to the people, that's also very important, because in many situations when some local communities side, say, with oil and gas companies, it's usually because their leadership is being paid by the oil and gas companies, right? And so there's quite a bit of corruption that takes place, unfortunately, among Indians, as with any other community in the world. And so it's very important that we monitor who we elect, who we place in places of leadership, etc. So those are just some suggestions. And then, of course, on the flip side of what we do, protests and resistance and putting our bodies on the line and all the things that we've been doing as communities across the world to protect our native ecologies, our ancestral ecologies. We need to continue to do that. In Ecuador, for example, tribes are constantly launching lawsuits against oil and gas companies, against the government itself, against local governors that are corrupt, etc. So taking things to court, unfortunately, is often another way that we can handle this problem.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph, for that. So we're going to move into the next question, and this question is for Jacqueline, but anyone else can chime in as well. What does environmental justice mean to you? And I think that this is very important, right? Given that Chelsea also mentioned that as Indigenous peoples, we're all not a monolithic group. So what does environmental justice mean to you, and how do you incorporate environmental justice principles into your work? So Jacqueline, can you take this one? Thank you.
Thank you. So what does the EJ mean to me? Well, that means, everything, as a tribal woman. It means protecting not only myself, but also my family, my clan, my tribe, the animals who feed and clothe my family, clan, and tribe, the waters that allow those animals to live in them, and the plants and the tundra. That is environmental justice to me. And trying to fight for all those societies, the animal society, the plant society, the water society, the air society. So there, because the human society are interreliant, interdependent, interwoven into all those societies. We are all different societies that need each other. And as a Yupik woman, protecting and honoring those other societies that are on this earth is my responsibility. And that is, as you know, in my TEK world, vision, because traditional ecological knowledge is this, traditional ecological knowledge it is a policy in the United States. Thankfully, finally, it's an EO, but it is an individual and a collective form of existence. How I try to incorporate EJ principles into my work, I try to share my TEK with non-tribal people. I tried as a NEJAC member on the, I sit on the National Environmental Justice Advisor Council to the EPA. I also advocate to my organization and network with some success so far on developing a EJ working group network-wide. Always putting in proposals to give a session on EJ 101 and how us as rural development specialists do our work through an EJ lens in our rural communities. And what does that really mean to do our work through an EJ lens? When we go into a community to help one neighborhood do economic development, are we making sure that even the less than the less are at the table and have been acknowledged in those plans and in those motions within that community, that we think we're going into the community and helping them out. But we have to make sure that we look around the corner and make sure that all are involved. So I really try to, as a cultural burial and as certain responsibilities I have in my tribe. Like my grandma told me, she goes, well, maybe if people know more about the Yupik, they wouldn't want to kill us. So I take it upon myself to try to be an educator of these things. And environmental justice is both a personal tribal thing within myself as a Yupik woman, and also as a professional trying to incorporate EJ principles into my organization's practice as we work in rural communities in the 13 Western states. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you for the work that you do, and also for highlighting, right, the responsibility that we carry as Indigenous peoples since the day we're born to the day we leave this earth. So to pass on the question to Chelsea, what does environmental justice mean to you, and how do you incorporate environmental justice principles into your work?
Yeah, thanks for that question. To me, environmental justice means balance, reciprocity, and respect. Putting in what you're going to get out, and actually putting in even more than you're going to get out. Being thankful for the things that the environment's offering, and not taking advantage. And that includes not only the land, the water, all of the minerals, subsurface, the things we cannot see, also the organisms that live in those environments, and then all the ones that we can see and hear. And the ways in which Native Renewables and myself use EJ principles is from the products we use. We work really hard to look for products that are recyclable, ones that will last a really long time, others that are made in the best way possible. We're still looking for, as many good products that also have a little impact in the environment, and some of those things are still being worked out, and so we are constantly on the lookout. We want to make sure that what we put out in the land is actually not going to offer any damage. Additionally, the off-grid solar units we install are for families that don't have electricity, that are really far from the utility grid, from like a half a mile to 5 miles to 10 miles, people who can't connect. So we do our best to work with those folk who are who may never have thought that they'd get electricity. So as Jacqueline had mentioned, when something is being created and looking around the corner to see who else is not there and who's not being included in the conversation, those are the folk that we want to work with. And then lastly, we use a lot of it, but one of the other pieces is informing and including our staff members who are from a lot of the communities that we work with into our decision making for our organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea, for that. So, Deborah, what does environmental justice mean to you, and how do you incorporate environmental justice principles into your work?
Thank you. Just to build upon the great responses that were already provided, the way that I think about it, I do think about it in distinct, I think, again, Indigenous or Anishinaabe sort of distinct ways in the conventional sort of definition of environmental justice, which I think are perfectly valid and needed. Clearly, there's lots of nasty things happening, but one of the things I always try to do is like, what is our own sort of thinking around this? Like, what's our own fancy word ontology around environmental justice? What do we even consider to be environment? I think Jacqueline did a great job of talking about what I think that looks like from her perspective, but I was nodding my head. I go, yes, that we think about these other entities in the natural world as being relatives and nations. So to build upon that, it's recognizing that environmental justice is extending it beyond the human dimension. And often it's very human oriented, which is absolutely needs to happen. Clearly, the state and proponents and industry are doing not good things, and there needs to be a focus on that. But for us, for thousands of years of our existence, we would have been trying to ensure environmental justice with our relatives and the natural world by realizing rights and responsibilities. Rights tends to be in like the conventional sort of environmental justice realm, and then our responsibility sort of more in the Indigenous realm, but obviously not only there. So, but to me, it also means by going beyond human dimension that these other entities and elements also have reciprocal obligations to us. So, for example, in the Anishinaabe conception of water is the relationship is reciprocal. Water is one of its purposes is to support life, but if humans come along and stop the flow of water, contaminate water, dump God knows what in water, then we've interfered. We've committed an environmental injustice to water, and water is no longer able to fulfill its responsibilities to support life. So harm's going to happen to aquatic life, it's going to happen to people. So to me, environmental justice is also how we relate in appropriate ways to the natural world, which we have guidance and instructions to do that. And I do think a lot of that guidance and instruction is relevant to how we engage with environmental justice more broadly in the historical and contemporary context. So what do we need to do? Well, anything that community is doing to support languages and the way of life, appropriate relations with the natural world, either through ceremonial or spiritual practices or on the land activities or education programs, are how you would incorporate that into work. And as an educator, that's the kind of work I get involved in. And I think fundamentally what we want to do is to be able to support life. Like, what are the things we're going to do to be able to support life? And I think Chelsea pointed to a number of things, but we want to be able to enable life to be able to continue its work to support life. So we want to support pollinators. We don't want to contaminate. We want to support aquatic life so they can fulfill their responsibilities and duties, not just to people, but to other life, water for fish. So that's all I would add to it. That I think that already exists and has existed for thousands of years in a lot of people's own knowledge and nations and practices. And I think part of our work with environmental justice is to revitalize those because they're often not talked about. Of course, communities have to decide what they're willing to share externally or not share externally. But I always thought that we already had our own environmental justice principles and our own way of thinking. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah, for that. So, my next question is for Joseph. Joseph, you mentioned that Indigenous solidarity, beyond settler borders, is very important for us to achieve environmental justice. So, my question for you, and I can also open it up to anyone else, how can we as Indigenous people strengthen our Black and Indigenous solidarities to deepen the environmental justice conversations that have taken place so far in this symposium? So I will pass it to Joseph, then Amber, and then open to anyone else. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. I think it's a very important question, and I think is really key to us really moving forward and addressing the current climate crisis within the parameters that we're in now, right? So it's a crisis because we don't have any time left. There's no time left for us to say, I'm Black, you're Indian, I'm white, you're this, I'm that, you're this. We have differences that we can divide ourselves on. The time for that is gone. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. It's due to ignorance, due to colonization, and how colonialism works to divide us rather than unite us. So to build these kinds of solidarities between communities of color, specifically Black and Indigenous communities who've experienced extremely similar histories, right? With important differences and variances that we all need to be aware of, but very, very similar histories in terms of dispossession, displacement, right, slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So the same, part of what I study is land tenure, for example, and the same things that happen to Indians across reservations happen to Southern Black farmers in terms of, the way that the land was divided, the way that inheritance was used against landowners in order to take land from them, etc. So there's so much similarity in terms of our experiences if we only bother to educate ourselves. The way you do that is you step outside of your comfort zone and you get involved with organizations that focus on Black lives and Black justice movements, etc. And if you're of Black descent yourself, you do the same with Indian communities, right? Show up and be part of those communities, engage with them, share your story and hear theirs. Those kinds of things. There's no easy way to show solidarity. A Twitter post is as useless as the time it took you to put it up there. You need to show up, you need to show political and physical, economic solidarity, and you need to speak out about what you see among these communities, right? And so, they need to become relatives as they are, right? As they are in reality, relatives to you as an Indigenous or Black person, right? So to do that, you need to act as a relative towards them, and so get involved in local, local movements, Black or Indigenous movements, And we need to show up together when it comes to protests, when it comes to standing up for Black lives and Indian lives, etc. These things are really important. And like I said, for us to address environmental injustices that continue to occur to all of our communities, we can't do it alone. We've tried that, and the powers that be have solidified their power politically and economically. We just can't do it alone as small communities with the few resources that we have, or as small movements here and there, right? We have to all stand up together. So if we want a hopeful future for ourselves, if we're young enough, if you're going to live into the 2050s, for example, let's hope that the 2050s are livable. Let's hope they're livable on this planet. Let's hope the 2070s are livable on this planet. And if you have young children, they're almost certainly going to live to be into their 80s and 90s thanks to medical advancement. I don't want to be on this planet 90 years from now. If things are as is, if things keep going the way that they've been going. So, if we want brighter futures for ourselves and our children, we really have to stop the divisions, to stop seeing people as different, and start seeing ourselves as really part of the same river of colonialism, right? We're on the same boat that colonialism has put us on, going down the same river of destruction. We need to do something about that together.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph, for that. Amber, how can we strengthen Black and Indigenous solidarities, especially to deepen the conversations around environmental justice that have taken place thus far in the symposium?
I think you're on mute, or at least I can't hear you.
Sorry, I pushed it, and of course it rebelled. So I just want to say I echo everything Joseph said. I think this question is really important. I think that Black and Native folks and all oppressed folks under settler colonialism and white supremacy and racial capitalism have to acknowledge that we have a mutual oppressor, and I think that could be our starting point for solidarity, right? We have to contextualize all of the things that all of us have endured and had to navigate under these systems, including the harms that we've caused each other. And I think it's really important to for us to acknowledge the harms, and even if they weren't intentional, right? Like even if it was about taking care of our families and our, in desperation, taking care of saving our lives. I think it's really important that we have discussions about the harm, but also that we contextualize that harm. I think it's really important that we listen to one another and also believe one another when we talk about what we're enduring under these systems. I think that sometimes people share their stories, share, what's happening in their communities, and then others might belittle that or not take it as something that's actually happening. And I think that sometimes that causes us to causes wedges in our communities. And so I think that listening, but also believing one another is crucial in establishing and maintaining solidarity. The other thing I think is important that we learn about each other from ourselves, or learn about our respective communities from our respective communities, because I think that what happens is a lot of times what we know about each other comes from our oppressors, and I think oftentimes that's often rooted in stereotypes, and then just also falsehoods that colonizers and oppressors tend to establish as a means of justifying the violence against us. So I think it's really important that we learn from one another, and then to challenge our biases that we have, established in our own minds about one another. So I think to solidarity, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I've been writing about it a lot. Is that there's this idea that we should just meet at the table. If we just meet at the table and hash out, the things that are going on, that's a solution. But I want to challenge us, and I want to encourage us, instead of trying to meet at the table, which is often colonial, which is often there's only 2 spots for all people of color, to let the land be our mediator and meet on the land. and to recognize one another's indigeneity, because I think sometimes Black folks aren't seen as displaced Indigenous peoples or the descendants of Indigenous peoples, but my African ancestors were Indigenous to their lands in Africa and were displaced off those lands, right? And so I think the land recognizes indigeneity even when it's displaced. And so I'm asking folks to challenge the idea that we need to meet at the table and instead use the land as a meeting spot and a place where we can talk about how we go forward and how we can practice not only solidarity, but futurity, because I want us to think about, you know, the ways in which we see it so distant and so far away versus like we have to do that work now because empires fall. They always do. And if the empire falls, what do we do if we haven't spent the time getting to know each other, getting the time to heal our wounds, to contextualize the pain and the harm that we've caused, right? And so I think solidarity requires us to do all this really hard and sometimes painful work. But when we say we want to decolonize, when we say we want to build solidarities, this is what it means. It means that we have to sit down and get to know each other and be vulnerable. And as my mentor and homie, Dr. Kyle May says, is that we should share a meal together. We should have like a barbecue powwow where we get together and like eat and talk about things that are our realities. And then from there, I think we learn to root for one another. We learn to actually care for one another like we care for family, right? And so, there's no solidarity without learning from one another, listening to one another, and believing one another.
Yeah, thank you for that, Amber. I think it's very important, right, to reflect on wanting the position at the table when we should go back to the land, right? Because the land is our mother. So, one of the questions that we have from the audience, and it kind of relates to a question that we had for the panel, is there has been recent increased environmental justice funding through the federal government, especially to the US government. And also, there's been new opportunities presented by the new presidential administration that kind of has elevated tribal leaders. But my question is, have these opportunities actually elevated tribal leaders, Indigenous communities, especially when discussing environmental justice and climate justice? And I will start with Deborah for this question.
Okay. It's a great question, and I'm really super keen to hear what others have to say about it. But I don't work in the U.S. context, so it's hard for me to answer that question specifically. But I can tell you about how it's playing out in the Canadian context. So similar kind of noises from the federal government, and I say noises, not like I have no idea how it's going in the US, and people will sort that out, but that's what it kind of is federally in Canada. So you see a lot of the rhetoric around in Canadian public policy around climate change. We don't have the committee set up the same way that the Biden administration does. There isn't like this direct conversation you can have with leaders who are setting policy. So despite climate change policy saying we're going to support Indigenous leadership and Indigenous knowledge, there actually isn't, as I mentioned before, there actually isn't any actual real support to do that. So organizations that I'm involved in, so the Assembly of First Nations, represents the First Nations across the country. So I'm on the Environment Climate Change Committee. So you kind of have to, again, you're in the advocacy role on the outside, kind of looking in and trying to advocate kind of through that way. So there's a lot of the rhetoric, there's a lot of the policy statements, Indigenous-led climate leadership and research, but there isn't the corresponding funding or programming or that goes along with that. So that's kind of how it's playing out. I mean, it's better than it was because previous government was major climate deniers, but at least this one sort of knows, the current one kind of knows there's like something going on. Like a lot of Canadian, actually Indigenous lands is the way I look at it. It's been burned and continues to be so. That's where people would be exercising their rights and livelihoods. So that's kind of how it's doing. But sometimes when you're in the radar, like the policies are putting you in, other people are paying attention, right? So ENGOs are and academia is. So So other entities other than government are paying attention because it's mentioned. Indigenous people have something to say about climate leadership and climate change. So there's been more attention in that respect. So so I'd say there's definitely more talking around it, but I would like to see more like real things happening on the ground to support it. So that's just some thoughts on in the Canadian context, and I'm really keen to hear and learn because I don't know how the question, like how that's playing out in the U.S. Maybe there's things I can learn from that I can share with folks that I work with. So hopefully that was helpful somehow. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah, for bringing in the Canadian perspective, right? So, our question is that there has been an increase in environmental justice funding and also tribal leaders being appointed to positions such as the Departments of Interior, Energy, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So, the question, and I will pass it to Chelsea, is do you think these steps are in the right direction?
Thank you for that question. I was actually going to send a message and say I can help to answer this if needed. So I think they're in a good direction. I don't think it's the right direction. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, but I will say that a few of the folk that have been added into the key positions of these departments have really opened up access to dialogue, not only between the tribal nations and the federal government, but also the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations like the nonprofits, the local communities, and with their tribal nations and together with the federal government. I think that has not happened in the little time that I've been around at the level that it has been. And it seems like these conversations and these meetings are a lot more proactive and with the consideration of healing. Again, this one meeting that I've been to, I think there were probably like 2 more before that, have been one of the first ones that I've heard about. And it feels good to be a part of, but it also is the question of like, why hasn't this happened in the past? Why, happy that it's happening now, and how is this going to continue in the future to have these conversations to build upon? And then also on the funding piece, there has been some communities that I know of and community leaders that I know of that have taken advantage of these opportunities, and it is also increasing the conversation about, for example, like how is redevelopment going to happen in some of these areas that we didn't know industry was going to contaminate the lands or the water, and so that's been pretty good to hear. It's also hard to hear, but also healing, and trying to find like what are those solutions and those options for the near future. There's more here that I can help to answer, but I'll turn it over to the next person.
Yeah, thank you, Chelsea, for bringing up that there's a lot of firsts happening for our Indigenous communities. So, Jacqueline, do you think these are steps in the right direction, or what is your opinion and take on this? Thank you.
Well, of course, I believe that anytime people of color are included, appointed, hired, asked, is always the right direction. Especially when there's policy, funding, and laws that affect those people of color's lives. And so I believe it is in the right direction. And also, just my limited involvement in the FACA, the Federal Advisory Council Act, with the NEJAC and the WEJAC. I don't sit on the tribal seat on the NEJAC. I sit on the non-governmental seat. But, my colleagues there's a tribal seat specifically for tribal nations on the NEJAC. The WEJAC, the White House Environmental Justice Council, has multiple tribal voices on that, and they have a separate tribal working group, addressing tribal legacy environmental justice issues. So there's other pathways and other pockets within the federal government where the tribal voice has been risen to, advise, to places that are nice, and where our expertise in our lives is being not only acknowledged, because we've always been, it's but been acted upon, and but the wheels of justice move slowly, as we know, and the right direction, it's not going to be a fast path. I know, fast pace, but it is in the right direction. Thank you so much for asking the question.
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline, for bringing that up. So, moving on to Amber and Joseph, do you think these are steps in the right direction that the current administration is taking, especially as it relates to more Indigenous representation at these environmental agencies and the environmental justice discourse?
Yeah, again, echoing all the other panelists, I think representation is important. But I'm often suspicious of it because I also think it's an attempt to reinforce colonial power, like imperial power. But I also know the value of having someone who has connection to community and is interested in actually dismantling systems. And so I do think that having Indigenous folks in positions of power is crucial to chipping away at that institutional power. However, I think we have to be suspicious of the intent of, colonial governments when placing people like us, from our communities in those high level positions. Because I understand colonial institutions to not really be interested in decolonizing, right? That is their demise. And so I think, it would be a very slow process because, I'm really weary of that. I think that Indigenous peoples, oppressed peoples, are more genius than our oppressors. And so I think that we have the ability to even navigate when put into those positions. But I also think it is very much a David and Goliath situation when you put, one person of color who represents all Indigenous people or all Black folks. There's an expectation that they're able to solve centuries of oppression and centuries of exploitation and violence. And I think that's a really hard burden to place on someone who has like all the right intentions, who has like their community's best interests in power. And I say kudos to Indigenous peoples, other people of color who actually, get into those positions and try to do the real work of dismantling. But I don't know if like the master's tools can actually, bring down the master's house. But I do think about infiltrating and how there have been many of historical, examples of how infiltrating have slowly brought down the master's house. So yeah, I think representation is important. I think that it is great to have people in power who look like us and who are brave enough to speak out against, empire and institutional power. I think it's a very interesting dance to have to do. And I can only imagine the burden and only imagine like the desire to want to, to address all of the problems, like when you get in that position of power, it's like not just environmental justice. It's like, what else can we also address while I'm in this seat for this many years, right? And so kudos to people who get there and are not, and keep a vision of like, this is why I'm here, and do it even when, people disagree with them. I can only imagine that burden. So yeah, representation is important. Having people in those key positions is important, but we have to remember, I think we have to keep in the back of our head that like colonial institutions are not interested in their own demise.
Thank you, Amber, for that. So, in the, being mindful of time, and also because I want Deborah and Jacqueline to give us our closing remarks. Badiuchi, everyone, for participating in this panel. And thank you for listening to everyone who has great expertise on these issues. So, Jacqueline and Deborah, do you mind giving closing words, especially a message tailored to our youth and the 7 generations to come?
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Deborah.
I was just going to say, I think you should have the last word because I'm the interloper from the across the border. So you should. I think in the work that I do, the message I try to give to youth is one, I try to like really try to support Indigenous led youth, like not me coming in as some middle-aged lady telling them how they should think about things, like really trying to support what they would like to do to recognize that they are climate change storytellers and that they should be part of the vision about what they want to see for the future so that they can start inheriting like solutions instead of problems from past and future generations, that they have important knowledge to share. Like we're experiencing climate change, our ancestors have, so those stories of their families matter. So they have really valuable knowledge to share, and they just kind of need the means to share. And folks like me need to be better at listening. So their experience really matters. And I think I would just end with this, that what they know, what they know, like the UN talks about this, and other researchers, is that Indigenous peoples caretake about 20% of the planet's landmass, and that's where about 80% of the biodiversity is, and that's where Indigenous languages are spoken. We know stuff, and I just give that message to say that all those initiatives that occur around language realization, land-based work, really matters in terms of envisioning a future for ourselves. And they have my support in doing that. So Chimugash for this opportunity, and I'll turn it over to Jacqueline.
Hello, thank you for that question. Many of you who joined us last year, and including my panelists, Chelsea and Deborah, know that I lost my child, my youth, my son, Tabaha. He was 15. I lost him New Year's Day, 2021, from fentanyl poisoning. So to the youth, I want to say, you are alive. Be alive. You can be Native and be alive, and that is good enough. If you want to live home and just take care of your family and your elders and your little brothers and sisters, that's good enough. If you just want to take care of your little plot of land and animal and dog and cat, that's good. If you want to stay home on your reservation all your life and don't go out to go get some big fancy college education, that's good enough. You're Indigenous. You're tribal. You are the salt of this earth, and the earth is salt of you. Our children know so much, more than us adults do, about the life and the birth and the death of this earth. 2 months before my son died, he came into the living room and he says, "Mom, we came from Black people," and I thought he was talking about the out of Africa there. I said, "Yeah, I know that." He goes, "No, Mom. My spirit God came to me last night. The Black people made this earth. The Native people, we designed it." And he showed me the plains. He was trying to explain his vision. And he said, "Your tribe went up north so they wouldn't kill you. And that's why but you fell in love with the environment. That's how come your people want to protect the Arctic so much. You stayed when the rest of us came back down." My son was half Yupik and half Dene. So when I see a Black person now, I have a different look at them based on what my child said about how Black people and tribal people made and designed this earth. Our children are so much. And we are all the 7th generation. Remember that. There were 7 generations before us. There's 7 generations after us. Whether you're elder, mid, baby, youth, we are all the 7th generation. Koyana for having us today. Thank you.